You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University podcast network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Thanks everybody for joining us on this week's episode of Fire University. Today, I'm pretty excited about this topic because I get this question all the time as someone who is an enthusiast about prescribed fire and using that to manage wildlife, and also as someone who thinks about turkeys probably more than I should. Maybe not in this company, but I certainly think about them quite a bit. And I also have two people that are really well known in the turkey world that I want to talk to. And specifically, I wanted to talk about the controversial issue of whether or not we should be burning during nesting season for turkeys. So I have Dr. Mike Chamberlain here with me, and I'm very glad to have you. I appreciate you joining us on the show. And also David Hawley, who you may know from the Wild Turkey Report. If you're active online, he is a private landowner and involved in this industry, and also a passionate turkey enthusiast. So really glad to have both of you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely.
Glad to be here, Marcus.
Yeah. So I don't want to beat around the bush too much. I know we're right on the cusp of turkey season, right in the peak of prescribed fire season. And this is a question I get all the time. Like I said, I'm a pretty strong advocate generally for expanding the burn window if possible. And the natural question that people have, and me included, is whether or not we should be considering the nesting season for turkeys, given that they nest on the ground and they're obviously vulnerable to fire at that time. So first, I guess I wanted to direct it to you, Mike. You know, I know you've done a lot of research on this topic and you're familiar with the literature based on it. And I just was wondering if you could give us a little bit of the information that's out there on this topic.
Yeah, sure. So there's been, as you know, quite a bit of work on wild turkeys and how they respond to fire. The kind of the bottom line with this bird, at least in the southern United States, is in pine-dominated system, this bird is inextricably linked to fire. They use plant communities that are fire dependent in many cases. They benefit from the kind of the stimulated seed bank, the early successional plants that are benefited and facilitated through routine fire return intervals. So you've got a bird that, for all intents and purposes, lives most of its life obviously on the ground, except when they're roosting, and that life is dominated by time spent in areas that are primarily succulent herbaceous plants. So we know that turkeys are benefited by fire, both from a kind of a habitat structure standpoint. In other words, prescribed fire tends to produce and promote plant communities that allow turkeys to see, and their vision is their primary mode for survival, or their primary means for survival. So that's a positive. The other thing that we know from many decades of research is that prescribed fire stimulates plant communities that are also very attractive for insects, and those insects provide forage for not only growing poults in the spring and summer, but also for adults throughout the spring and summer. So you kind of piece those two things together, and fire, in a general sense, produces plant communities that are not only structurally conducive to turkeys using them, but are also providing resources that are critical throughout the life cycle of this bird.
Well, that's kind of my general feel as someone who does a fair amount of research, a lot of research on fire, but a fair amount with turkeys specifically related to fire as well. I kind of have the general same sense that you do. In terms of while they're nesting, what are the considerations that people, I think it's a valid concern that people are worried about burning specifically at that time, particularly when you have a lot of burn days that aren't necessarily during nesting. I was just curious, are there some studies that speak directly to nest survival when you actually do burn at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So myself and several colleagues have monitored birds across fire managed landscapes since 2014 was when that work started, and we've tracked hundreds of birds. We've monitored at this point close to 800 nests that were on those landscapes, and we see very, very little loss of nest to prescribed fire. Now, I will say that the caveat there is a lot of the fires that are occurring on our study sites tend to be fires that are February, March, April, to where the burn window is essentially shut down around the time that birds start into their incubation sequence. And I want to follow up on that in a minute, but the bottom line is we don't see a tremendous amount of nest loss to fire. The caveat again being that much of the fire is occurring at the very onset of nesting behaviors, and that's a critical point. What we tend to see is that on sites where the fire return interval is consistent, in other words, fire is placed within these stands at a consistent interval. In other words, stand A is burned every 2 years and not suddenly burned every year, but there's a consistent return interval. What ends up happening is turkeys end up nesting in stands that are not scheduled to be burned. And that's an important point, because all things being equal, as the return interval gets longer, birds perceive that as not being nest habitat. In other words, once the return interval is 4 or 5 years, they're not nesting in those stands anyway. Where they're nesting tends to be in 1 and 2 year roughs, and I'm generalizing a little bit here, but tends to be 1 and 2 year roughs. So in other words, stands that were burned last year or the year before. And that ends up putting most of our marked birds in stands that are not scheduled to be burned during that year. I will say, coming back to the point about the fire occurring primarily before or at the very early onset of nesting, we have conducted quite a bit of work on sites where growing season fire was the primary fire use on those sites, longleaf dominated sites. And we also saw almost no nest loss on those sites as well. And the reason in that case was the scale, and I know we need to talk a lot about this, but the scale at which the fire was applied was so small that the probability that a given nest was going to end up in that stand was very low. And that kind of collectively is what the research has shown, that it's an interaction between the timing of the fire and the scale of the fire that's going to ultimately dictate how much impact you're going to have to nesting efforts.
Sure. I know some of the work that I was involved with in longleaf systems was, where the fires were actually set primarily during nesting season, virtually none of the nests were exposed to it because of what you said. I think that's a really good point. What turkeys in these landscapes, especially pine landscapes where fire is a recurring part of, the community succession, the structure that they actually select to nest in, it sounds like to me, based on what you were saying and based on my own observations, is in the stage that isn't ready to be burned in the schedule again.
Right.
So even
Exactly.
if it did co-occur, so even if there is a nest on the ground when you light the fire, it's probably in a part or one of the burn units that's not actually on the docket to be burned anyway.
That's it. That's exactly what our work has shown.
Yeah, and that aligns a lot with some of the work I was involved with as well. So I think you brought up some really good points that I want to circle back to, especially with scale. But look, I wanted to get your perspective on this, David, as someone who is really avid about turkeys and has been involved with turkeys in a lot of different places, including on your own place as a private landowner who is actively burning. I know I have talked to you quite a bit, and I see you put stuff out online commonly about burning for turkeys. You understand the value of that tool, and you're actively using it on your own land to manage turkeys. So, what do you think about this topic? Is I don't want to say the scary thing, but the thing that gets people fired up, we'll use a pun, gets people fired up about this topic, specifically about burning during nesting?
Well, I'm gonna, basically agree with everything Mike said. I mean, this is a bird that I see also as a landowner as one that, if you could say that the quail is the firebird, I'd say that, or fire dependent species, I would say the wild turkey in our current ecosystem is the fire aided one. And, throughout the Southeast, I mean, we've got this patchwork of us landowners out there that we've got to step our game up on getting more fire on the landscape. And to do that, we can't rely on dormant season fires. I mean, you see a lot of fires around the end of January, February, and 1st of March, and then you don't see smoke plumes until the following year at the same time. And that's a problem for this bird, I think. And I think that a lot of the issue, obviously, and it's kind of, as Mike has said before on other podcasts, social media is one of the best things to happen to this bird and also the worst thing to happen to this bird, because some of the things that the outcry, I guess you'd say, of seeing some pictures of a burnt up nest, there's a lot of context that's probably missing from that picture. That he said the magic word, and I think that entire discussion is scale. A 4,000 acre burn unit in a national forest, yeah, there's probably inherent risk there that there's going to be nests impacted. But Mike, as you alluded to on another podcast I listened to, their situation in those cases is not necessarily driven by the same motives as, say, an individual landowner. They're trying to reduce fuel loads. I can be different. I'm not trying to burn 4,000 acres. I'm trying to burn 400 or 300. So I'm able to be a little bit different in when I can burn. I can do growing season burns that aren't necessarily in the nesting season. But I think the bottom line is we as hunters and as landowners have to understand this bird really, really, really needs fire right now. And that's going to have to require us thinking outside of just dormant season fires to do that. We're not going to be able to get it all accomplished. And quite honestly, from what I've seen from both of y'all, the response from the understory, the turkey really needs kind of both dormant season and growing season burns in the matrix to accomplish what they need on the ground. That's just kind of my elevator spiel on why we need more burns and, kind of thoughts on it.
Well, I think you're hitting the nail on the head with, we're in a time where fire is particularly important to promote habitat characteristics, not just for nesting, but for other things, for the bird and other species. but we're also in a time where resources are limited from state and federal agencies to accomplish that, which often results in them trying to be more efficient. And scaling up is one of the ways that you can do that. But we also, I think, are in a time where, you know, there's a stronger barrier to landowners to actually actively engage in using fire for a variety of reasons, which we belabor on this podcast a lot. And there's also a fair amount of research to show that a large portion of the burn window goes underutilized. And one of those portions of it that's most underutilized is during nesting. And I think there are a couple of things I want to get to, and I'll pitch it back to you, Mike, because you're the expert on this. There are a couple of things that I think are important to consider biologically from the bird that we haven't really covered directly related to this, that I think you can cover well. But there's also this issue of scale, which I definitely think is something extremely relevant. And I know, Mike, you've had some recent work on the issue of how big should burn blocks be. And I've had a little bit of thought put into that in a couple of peer-reviewed publications as well. So I guess first, that example that goes viral, so to speak, on social media that you're referring to, David, where you see that burned up nest, we don't have that context. Some of that context is potentially related to scale, but the other context I think is important is the biology of the bird. So, Mike, when a nest does get burned, what happens in terms of that turkey's individual nesting success for that year? Does it mean that it is completely done, or how does the hen turkey respond to that situation?
Yeah, so it seems to be highly site and individual specific in regards to whether a bird renest. The general idea is, if a bird loses their first clutch, they will, in many cases, they will attempt a second clutch. That's a bit of a loaded kind of question, because we do know that the first nest is what primarily matters. In other words, their initial nest attempt that's where most of our poults are generated. We get some birds that hatch a second or even a third clutch, and those poults survive, but most production is driven by the first nest attempt. And that first nest attempt across the Southeast generally is going to be occurring from the end of the first week of April to about the beginning of the third week of April. So somewhere around April 15th, most birds in the Southeast, deep South anyway, are going to be on the nest or in some type of behavior associated with the nest. They're laying, they're about to start incubating, whatever. So yeah, they will renest, but we also know that we really need to hang our hat on those initial clutches being successful. We also know from a wide body of research that the poults that are hatched early in the year have a better survival probability than poults that are hatched later in the year. So there, for a variety of reasons, there's motivation as land stewards for us to make sure that initial clutch is successful if at all possible. To your point about the burn window, I completely agree. In fact, I will often be criticized for, hey, you're advocating fire during the nesting season. And my response is always the same. Absolutely. Because the nesting season for the wild turkey extends from very late March, early April in the deep South until June. But we can't reach our goals and just say we're not going to put any fire on the landscape from late March until June. That's just not practical. So for us to realize our objectives, which my objective as a land manager is, I want to see fire return to as much of the landscape where it should be applied, where it naturally occurred, as possible. And if we do that, it's going to benefit the species. There's no question. How we do that and avoid that narrow time when most birds are on nest, I think is completely attainable. It just takes looking at the science and saying, okay, most nests are on the ground during this window of time. So if we're going to conduct fires during this, say, 30 or 40-day period, we need to minimize scale. In other words, make the burn units as small as we can within reason, to try to minimize the probability that a single nest or multiple nests are going to be lost. And I think if we do that, then in the end, what we're going to realize is losing a couple of clutches here and there on the landscape, but producing a landscape that is much more beneficial for this bird. It's literally, you're comparing apples to oranges. If you ask me, would I sacrifice a handful of clutches this year on a study site to end up with a forest community that was structurally conducive to a bird using it? That's a no-brainer in my opinion.
No-brainer, yes, I'm guessing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I think those are great points. And yeah, that's really interesting information. It sounds like, okay, we've got a broader story here, right? And there's still that instinct from people. And David, you can speak to this if you'd like to, as the the person that's thinking from about this from that landowner's perspective and wanting as many turkeys as possible. There is some hesitation to set any fire during that burn season, but or during the nesting season. But to your point, Mike, if we actually didn't light any fire during nesting season for that entire range, that's the majority of our burn days within a year.
Yeah.
So that's probably not a reasonable approach. And I'm right with, as someone that works on habitat almost exclusively in my program, that is exactly the mindset that I normally take is, okay, we have this bigger story. Scale is definitely a part of it. I want to circle back around to this in a minute, but a nest lost, that first nest is most important you're talking about. So if that one's lost, that might decrease reproduction for that year, but the bird could re-nest and get something out of that. But there's also the adaptation of the bird to nest in places that are unlikely to burn, at least in the systems we've been talking about. So they tend to pick that roof that's not on the list. And then we may sacrifice one or two here and there to increase nesting success and other success in the life stages of the bird, which could or probably do overcome the cost of losing a nest here and there. It sounds like collectively, if we think about everything you were saying, that's kind of where we're at, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I kind of use this analogy, and I've said this elsewhere. We as human beings get really caught up in this kind of mindset where we look at birds, we look at what's occurring on our back 40 or our property or the local WMA or whatever it is, because that's the way we work as human beings. That's the way our minds work. And I use the analogy, what we need to do is we need to not focus on, so think about a football game. So you're watching a football game in person. You follow the ball. So wherever the ball goes, that's where you're watching. You're looking at the quarterback, you're looking at the running back runs and he's tackled and that's it. You follow the ball. The coach, on the other hand, is standing on the sidelines and he's looking at the quarterback, he's looking at offensive line, he's looking at everything. And the reason that the coach's perspective is important is because he or she is not getting caught up in where the ball is. He or she is looking at the entire playing field and what's going on. And I think when you talk about prescribed fire, yes, we conduct fires on our properties or our, on the properties that we have access to that we can influence. But we all need to be thinking about this story at a much broader scale. We need to be using the coach's viewpoint, not following the ball, because following the ball mentality is what gets you caught up in the rabbit hole of, well, a nest may be burned. Yes, that may happen, but from the broader coach's view, losing a nest in a 50-acre block one time on one site is not affecting the reproductive potential of this species across the region. But you putting fire on that 50 acres, if you do it consistently through time, is going, and we all do that. All of us can contribute to that. If we all do that, then we're going to see that from a coach's perspective, the southeastern United States is a much better place for a wild turkey. That's the kind of mindset I try to encourage people to use.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, you hit on something that, I've been preaching is, there's 2.5 million turkey hunters in the U.S. And, I've been so encouraged the last, and I hope you agree, or if you disagree, that's fine. But I've been so encouraged to see people that for so long only cared about pulling the trigger that are starting to be introspective and saying, hey, I need to do more in my own way, and obviously there's some people that are getting into trapping. There's some people that are starting to burn. They're planting clover. They're doing TSI, but they're caring about more than just simply showing up on opening day, buying their hunting license, hunting the whole year, just simply being a consumer. They're kind of seeing that bigger picture. Would you kind of agree?
Oh yeah. Yes, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
And fire is just part of that bigger picture.
Yeah.
Sure.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that I agree too. I get feedback on that same line of thinking a lot from multiple species, but there are a lot of people that are realizing, especially with turkeys, the populations are not thriving like they used to be, and there are lots of reasons that might be, which Dr. Chamberlain covers more than anybody. But this is one tool or one practice that could be incorporated into the toolbox to help in a big way at that I guess that landscape view, or the coach's view, as you put it, Mike. So I think that's a really good point. Along those same lines, you made me think of something, looking at it from that point of view, from a fire on the landscape point of view, but also looking at it from the point of view of the turkey's biology. We often focus on nesting, and that's been a barrier. And I do want to get back to you, David, and ask you a question specifically from your point of view as a landowner about that barrier. But before we get into that, we think about the vulnerability of that nest to fire, but we don't think about as much, or at least a lot of people don't, in my experience, think about what about the success of the poults that are being raised right after the nest is successful. So I was curious. I know I've been involved in a little bit of work, and you probably much more. How does having access to a recently burned area within the same year, right after hatching, influence poult success?
We're not exactly sure how it influences success at a broad scale, but behaviorally, there's no question that poult broods that have access to a recently burned stand use it. There's no question. We have numerous birds that very clearly hatched their clutch and then moved as quickly as they could to a part of the landscape where they had consistent access to recently burned stands. We also see a lot of use of broods in areas where you have a 1-year rough adjacent to a newly burned stand. So you have good escape cover, 1-year rough, and you have recently burned stands where you've got a flush of vegetation, you've got insect communities that are increasing. So yeah, we do see that. We also see that turkeys avoid areas where the intensity of the fire was higher. And to me, and we see this particularly with broods, and to me that shows a pretty clear story there. The reason the intensity gets higher is because fuel loads are higher. So you've got these stands where the return interval is too long, or in some cases, the stand has never been exposed to fire, and you ignite the stand and you get really significant scarring in places. And turkeys realize, well, okay, that's not a positive, which speaks, in my opinion, speaks volumes to the need to have consistent return intervals and do this. This is not a one-time shot. You don't just burn the stand and walk off. I mean, you burn it and you come back and you burn it, in future years. And if you do that, this bird very clearly perceives the structure and the vegetation that they need. They know where it's at on the landscape. They know where to nest. They know where to take these broods, and things work out pretty smoothly. When we don't have consistent return intervals, that's where you start getting into situations where you're not getting as much benefit from the fire as you would had you used a consistent return interval. I know I got a little bit off topic, but the brooding question is interesting because I personally suspect, and I have some data to get at this. Turkeys nest anywhere. They nest in the craziest places you can imagine. And their nest sites don't always look like we think they should look. In fact, in many cases, they don't look like anything I would think they should look like. And they make it work or they don't. And I say that to point to what I think is potentially a real problem in the South, and that is brood habitat. We see reasonably poor nest success, but we see dismal brood survival. And that's a real problem. And given the fact that poults need vegetation that is literally inches tall, not feet tall, it speaks to the notion that we need to alter plant communities to produce early successional succulent stuff. And prescribed fire is the primary way of doing that in our region. There is no question.
Especially at the scales that you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. So as I move around the landscape, the more and more I think about it, and the more and more I reflect as I visit different properties, I don't see in most cases a lack of nesting cover. What I see is vegetation that by and large is too thick, too tall, too dense, too rank. Mm-hmm. And broods don't use those areas. And if they do, their survival sucks.
Yeah.
So
to put it bluntly.
Yeah. I mean, we need to do a better job at producing more open plant communities that are conducive to this bird moving through it.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I'm going to switch it to you in just a second, David. But I think the data that I have, it's a different kind of data than you typically get, Mike, and I don't know what all you have going on, but I normally use cameras for a lot of my work rather than radio tagging, like a lot of your work I'm familiar with. But one thing that we will do is set a fire and then immediately put a camera right behind it. And often it's a grid of cameras across blocks. And it is astonishing to me how fast wildlife are back in it, but particularly turkeys. It, in some cases, it's the same day, but it's very, very often the next day from the burn that they're already in it. And one of the things that I have a little bit of data like you were talking about, but not a full-blown project yet, to the level that we would want for to hang our hat on. But it is pretty astonishing that when that is a freshly burned area with just often a couple inches tall vegetation, the hens will be in that with their broods. We see it very commonly, and much more commonly than in those studies than in the other treatments that had been burned at a different length of time since then, or maybe not burned at all. Certainly we see them with broods in the burned area more than not burned at all. So
Sure.
it's interesting that, looking at it from a little different perspective, your data sounds like it shows a pretty similar story, although we may not necessarily be able to connect it directly to the survival of the poults at this point. It is a pretty clear indication that hens want to get poults into it.
Yeah, I want to go back to something Mike said that I think is maybe kind of a way that we as landowners can kind of address this, but I keep going back to the notion of scale. And so many landowners, I think, when they start thinking about burning and they look at their 50 acres that they need to burn, and they start getting a little bit intimidated by doing that all at once. It's a stand that maybe fire was excluded. And perhaps we need to kind of start molding the mindset of burn what you can, when you can, get comfortable with it, build your experience level up. Don't try to, build Rome in a day. And perhaps doing so is going to create some really strong benefits for turkeys. And let me kind of ask you this, Mike. When I hear you say that, we find nests basically anywhere, there's not like a general area that they nest, and perhaps that we've got more issues on the poult survival side of things. I know the study y'all did where you kind of modeled out the grid and you got to the 50 acres was kind of that break even point where benefits started going down after that. Would smaller sizes and creating even more of a checkerboard perhaps accomplish two things? Getting more fire on the ground because people are less intimidated by that. But secondly, create even more of a mosaic that could benefit these poults where they're not having to move that 1,000-yard mark or meter mark that y'all have noted in another study to find that succulent growth. They're literally going right across a fire break and finding that from where their nest site was.
Yeah, my gut would say probably yes. There's a lot that goes into that relative to, there's a lot of literature not on turkeys per se, but on birds in general, relative to patch sizes and how it influences nest success. So at some point you end up with so much, I'll call it, it's not fragmentation, but in some ways it is. You're taking plant communities and you're creating smaller and smaller and smaller patches of suitable cover from a nesting perspective. At some point, I think you'd end up being counterproductive from a predation standpoint. But I see your point. The ideal
Why would that be,
scenario,
Mike? I mean, that to me would create even more of a dispersing factor on the predators.
well, what happens, and without going too far in the weeds, so with turkeys, what we see clearly is they don't distribute their nest in a way that's solely driven by vegetation. Their sociality causes them to stay away from other hens when possible. So we don't see these birds kind of like with ducks, for instance. You go up to North Dakota and you find a patch of grass that's ideal nesting cover, and there's dozens of nests inside of that patch. We don't see that with turkeys because their sociality causes them to want to stay away from other hens. One, because they parasitize each other, and two, because their social kind of rank dictates that they want to be on their own. So I think at some scale, what we see, and we have some work we're getting close to publishing on this, at some scale we see that turkeys just stay away from each other, and that by de facto causes them to kind of disperse their nest into areas where maybe it doesn't look as good as so in other words, there's a really good looking spot right across the road. Why didn't she go in there? Well, there's another hen that's incubating in there, and we think, is staying away from that hen. So she goes over here somewhere else. I think that the point you brought up relative to having this broad distribution of places where birds could quickly go and brood, that is on the money. because we clearly see that the farther a brood has to move from their nest site, the more likely they are to die. A brood on the move is a dead brood. A brood that can use a small daily range and they sit tight, that's a brood that makes it. So if a hen can leave some spot on the landscape where she's nesting and very soon be in a recently burned stand or a pasture type situation that's rotationally grazed and it's high quality herbaceous cover, then she has a greater chance of surviving. If she has to move a long distance and she has to continually move to find brooding cover, she's going to lose the brood. So yeah, having widely, more dispersed kind of a broad distribution of recently burned stands that are well managed, that would absolutely be beneficial. There's no question.
Yeah, so I want to chime in here. I'm right on board with everything and how it's going, and that's kind of where I wanted to lead us into with the scale question. It sounds like there certainly is too small. You could break up your landscape, your stands into too small of a units, but in general, we're thinking about fire blocks as potentially being too large, or at least in many cases they can be. So one thing that might benefit managing turkeys, it sounds like, would be during nesting. Maybe you have a couple of units that are smaller units. It may be better to target those during that time frame so that you avoid burning up any nests that are on the ground and active. But the other side of that coin, that it allows you to not burn a nest during the active nesting, but it also lets you get more ground burned, and having those small patches dispersed across the landscape so that they're always close, so that you can have that 1 year rough of really good escape cover right next to that really high quality brooding area for feeding and use. It sounds like that if you can create that matrix, that's a pretty important consideration when you're managing your property, especially if you only have access to a few hundred acres or less. Is that what I'm hearing from, based on the different things we talked about?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in some, to your point, Marcus, in some situations, yeah, you could split up blocks that are smaller than they need to be if managing this bird is your primary focus. But I think in many cases, and David hit on this earlier, is, if burning larger blocks is something that's intimidating, then split them in half. Try to be creative and come up with ways from a broader perspective of ensuring that you do have recently burned areas that are juxtaposed to stands that were burned in a previous year. Yeah, that's a little more trouble, but in the end, it will reap benefits if we all kind of think about it from that perspective. The scale issue is a hot topic because, private landowners, like David clearly said earlier, yeah, he can do what he wants within reason, obviously. I mean, we all know it costs money. You have to be able to create smaller blocks, and I get all of that. But you have private landowners that have that flexibility and have the means to do that, and then you have state and federal agencies who could, in many cases, also do that, but they're looking at this picture through a completely different lens than the private landowner. They're looking at it through the lens of, in many cases, fuel load, reductions, and in some cases, federal mandates to reduce those fuel loads, and that's an important point. So the scale issue, I think, in many ways becomes the most contentious issue. I hear a lot of griping about burning during the nesting season, but I don't hear a lot of griping about burning a little bit during the nesting season.
Mm-hmm.
The gripes I hear are about, hey, buddy, I just went down the road and saw a 3,000 acre burn that was ignited on May the 1st. Or last year I got picture sent to me of a 4,400 acre burn that was ignited like April the 18th or something.
Mm-hmm.
When people express concerns about that, those, in my opinion, are legitimate concerns.
Yeah.
And so the scale is, in my opinion, maybe I'm biased, but I think the scale issue becomes more problematic.
I mean, that's why I have you on here, Mike. Your opinion is extremely valuable since you have done probably more work on this bird in this context than anybody. So I think that's a valid concern, and I share it with you. And someone, when I was working on my PhD work and postdoc, and then a little bit since then, that was one of the things I immediately keyed in on is, when we're talking about scale from a state or federal agency point of view versus a private landowner, they're already on very different scales that they are considering anyway. And that's for many different reasons. Even when wildlife is the primary objective with those agencies, they may have mandates that they must burn so much acreage. They have limited staff. We can go on and on about why that might be, but I'm with you. If we're burning thousands of acres at a time during nesting, that's probably not a very good thing. And it may not just be because you burn up all the nest. It may also be because there's not access to escape cover and the other things we've talked about in the episode. But I think that's a really good point, that normally the griping that I hear also is because of that 3,000 acre burn, not because of the 3 acre or even 30 acre burn during that time. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good point. So David, I saw you wanted to add something.
Yeah, and this is maybe a loaded question. If Mike just says I don't want to touch this, I understand. But I mean, in these cases where there's these really, really large burns, I mean, is it possible or even probable that declines can stem in very localized cases and very, I mean, obviously it's not going to impact the entire state of South Carolina or anything like that, but could declines be stemming from some of these large fires, or is it just simply a drop in the bucket that, long term is not going to have an impact?
Yeah, that is a loaded question. But I think the bigger picture is these fires in our own back door here. We drive down the road and we see a very large fire that's consumed several thousand acres of forest, not the overstory, obviously, but the understory. And it's mid-April and we get concerned. I don't look at turkey populations in that vein. I'm trying to think broader. That's a problem locally. The degree that of problem that creates, we're not exactly sure, but here's my concern with that. And that being these larger fires. So we've very clearly shown a couple of things with GPS telemetry. One, immediately after a burn, turkeys use the edges of those recent burns. Edges being about 250 meters in. So if you take a 50 acre burn and you you buffer the edge by 250 meters, you'll realize that most of that 50 acres, depending on the shape of the stand, is usable habitat the day after the fire. And in some cases, the day the fire is still smoldering. And Marcus alluded to this. If you take a 3,000 acre burn and you draw that same 250 meter buffer around, you end up realizing that most of that stand is not usable habitat from a turkey's perspective for some extended period after that burn occurs. That to me is a real problem, because we don't know that would be contributing to, say, a local decline in populations. But there's a guy that's since retired, his name's Fred Guthrie, that was big in this notion of usable space for quail, and this notion that we need more usable space. Well, if you kind of think about that analogy here with turkeys, if we know that fire at a certain scale produces habitat that we know turkeys are not going to use for some period of time after the fire, then in some ways we are creating non-usable space, despite the fact that we're using a management activity that in a general sense is beneficial to this bird. That to me speaks volumes towards the need to plan our fires accordingly, knowing that they're not going to walk into the center of a 2,000 or 3,000 acre fire a week after the fire or 2 weeks after the fire. They're just not going to do it. We've clearly shown this with GPS work. They hang right around the edge. So that, I don't know if that directly answers your question, but my concern is not about the scale relative to, say, a decline. And they may be this kind of the same topic, but I kind of look at the scale issue and think, well, gosh, I mean, if I know that I'm producing habitat that a bird's not going to use, then why am I burning it? I mean, the whole point of if I'm managing for turkeys, I want to use prescribed fire because I want to produce a plant community that bird is going to use, and I want them to use all of it. And if they don't, then I'm using resources. I'm doing something on the landscape that's actually counterproductive. And that's a problem to me, whether it's prescribed fire or any other technique. If the scale at which we're implementing anything we're doing is counterproductive, then we need to step back and look at ourselves and say, well, we need to address this. And the data clearly shows that scale matters. And once you get above several hundred acres, this bird, they don't use it. Their use declines to the point where it's almost a coin flip, literally a coin flip, as to whether they'll use what you just burned or whether they're going to use something adjacent to it. Because at some scale, they don't look at across that stand and say, the center of that is okay, I'll walk out there. That's not how they perceive their environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right there with you, Mike. Great points. And I just wanted to add to it. And Dave, if you have something to add to it, please feel free. But I was just recently working from a fire angle about scale. I just published a paper with one of my graduate students where we basically went through all of the syntheses in the literature where people were trying to gather all the information on different aspects of prescribed fire and did that globally. And the least of all the metrics we looked at, the least considered metric or the least data-driven discussion in terms of topics about prescribed fire in all of the literature base for the last decade was scale. So not only, are you showing with your research and we know that scale is an issue in all aspects of ecology. I mean, it's pervasive. Some of the most foundational work in our field is based on the fact that scale always matters in a predictable way in a lot of cases. It's amazing to me that that's one of the least addressed topics that we have. So I guess on my side of things, that probably tells me that I need to be thinking about that and trying to address that. And another thing that I wanted to add related to scale that I personally have done and watched it, and some of you that are listeners that have carried a drip torch around probably have done this, and I'm not necessarily trying to scold you about it, but one thing that happens really commonly is we'll burn an area and then a patch of it doesn't burn. And particularly if we're getting up into the hundreds or thousands of acres, that, having a mosaic within your burn unit where the fire didn't actually consume all the vegetation could be a really important thing, especially at those larger scales. But we often will go back and specifically try to get that to burn, just to burn that patch. And I have personally done that, and I have told people that's probably a bad idea, particularly when you're on the upper end of that scale. But having that escape cover laid within the burn patch could be important for turkeys with some of these larger burn units as well. So it's something to think about. So David, what were you saying? I think
I actually had the privilege of touring a landowner's property in Wilcox County, Alabama, and he's kind of old school in the way that he burns. He'll lay off his fire breaks, whenever the needle cast and leaf drop is stopped. And he'll go out on a good day and he'll just throw out a single match and just let it just do its thing until the humidity gets up and it plays out. And so it's really almost like he's replicating Mother Nature in that sense. And his turkey numbers are excellent. I don't know if that's the reason why, but it's pretty cool to see how he is taking almost Mother Nature's, the lightning strike approach with how he burns.
Yeah, there's a landowner that I've worked with in northern Mississippi. I've worked with him extensively, and he's really interested in quail, namely. But he's let me do a lot of research on his property, and we've talked over the years. And I asked him one time about, the way that he did things when he was a kid, when they were managing for quail, and they rode around on horseback, and they'd just pitch matches out, and if it would burn, they'd let it burn. Now, obviously, we're not advocating folks go out and do that, but yeah, it is interesting to think about that point source ignition. But there are a lot of things that I've worked on over the years and still am working on about the fire spread through the system, and the patchiness of the burn and how important that could be. And it seems like it's definitely relevant to our conversation here that some patchiness within the burn unit could be really important from a habitat standpoint. And we could also take ignition patterns, that promote that sort of heterogeneity and fire spread to even encourage that. And based on your visit, maybe that's a good idea. The landowner that I know that used to do that back in the day, they're covered up with turkeys too, although he doesn't still do that now. But yeah, it's a really interesting thought, that we talk about these burn unit sizes, but we could have existing vegetation within it that's unburned, and that could be an important consideration as well. Maybe a little harder to translate into management action than to control the size of the burn unit, but certainly something to think about. All right, guys. Well, I really appreciate you joining us. I wanted to give you a few minutes to, if there are any topics that we didn't cover that you think are really important right here, now would be a good time for us to go into them.
I don't really have anything. I don't know if David has anything. I think we covered the topic pretty well.
Well, you're leaving me an open door. We could be here. No, Mike,
Yeah,
I did want to ask.
I actually
you
just
though,
have my.
Yeah.
You have your foot in the door.
Yeah, I have my foot in the door.
I'm not leaving you.
It seems to me almost, Mike, like we're at a point with regards to turkey management, and it's not just burning, but a lot of other things that perhaps we all as stakeholders in the interest of this bird need to kind of almost chart kind of a battle plan moving forward about how we're going to get more fire on the ground. What are the best practices if someone does choose to engage in predator control? Obviously we talk a lot about the regulatory side of things, but, I see a lot of positives in that we're almost building this army of sorts of people that care. Now we need to kind of equip them with the plan that we're all kind of pushing in the same direction, and perhaps try to teach them how to do it. Would you think that may be something we need to all sit down at the table and figure out as a community that loves this bird?
Yeah, I think we're in a situation right now where, we're sitting here talking about fire and a management technique that benefits this bird. It's one of many things that we need to sit down and as a group and discuss and try to figure out how to do more, how to do better as a group, as a collective, not David on his property or Mike on his property, but us on our properties, and we're all in this fight together. And I'm encouraged. I see a lot of momentum, podcasts and discussions like what we're having right here. If it stimulates somebody or multiple somebodies to start doing a better job of managing their property, or to reach out to a local forester or anything to try to jumpstart, hey, I'd like to put some fire on my land. Can you help me? then it's worth having these discussions. If we don't have these discussions, we're going to look back in the future and we're going to wonder why we didn't, because turkeys and other species, and that's an important thing I think people need to understand is, we're talking about fire and turkeys, but the plant communities that benefit wild turkeys that are promoted with prescribed fire benefit a multitude of other species. They benefit species that we're concerned about, and we should be, because animals that use early successional plant communities globally in many cases have declined. And we don't do a good job at managing habitat at broad scales. We have to do better, and prescribed fire is a way of doing that. So it's not just a turkey question to me, although that's what drives my life really, but it's a question of, are we going to be the best stewards we can? And if the answer is, well, yes, I want to be the best steward that I can, then prescribed fire is something you need to consider implementing on your property. If you have forest communities that are capable of being well managed with fire, and they're not just pine dominated communities. There are a lot of plant communities that across this country that can be managed successfully with prescribed fire. So I think people need to absolutely be thinking about, what can I do on my property? What can I do to influence my neighbor? What can I do to influence a family member? Whatever the case may be, we have to do more.
Yeah, I agree. And that's what we're all doing here, right? We're trying to find creative ways to get information to people to help, try to help. And I really appreciate you guys helping me to do that today. And one of the things that you said, Mike, it stimulates some thought for me. It's important for us to understand and realize what those barriers are. And I think one of those for a long time, not necessarily specifically with turkeys, but just ground nesting birds in general, quail and turkeys are the two that come up most often for me. That's been a barrier that's limiting our burn window, is to burn during nesting season. So I appreciate you all coming on to tackle that potentially controversial issue, but it's an important one to address, because I'm with you. We realize that there's always winners and losers, but one of the things I really love about fire is it is one that addresses the issues with habitat broadly for a lion's share of the species that we are concerned about. And normally the losers are the ones that we're less concerned about in this part of the world, at least. So, that's one of the things I love, and I'm right there with you on your point. So, before we conclude the show, I wanted to give our audience an opportunity to find you guys. I know that you're really active on social media and other places. So if you could take a minute, tell us, to our audience, how they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me on any social media platform. Facebook, if you just type my name in, you'll find my page there. On Instagram and Twitter, my handle is @WildTurkeyDoc, just Wild Turkey DOC. It's just one word. If you are interested in emailing me, you can find my email address on the University of Georgia's webpage. I try to be as responsive as I can within reason. I get a lot of messages and a lot of emails every day, but I do respond to everybody at some point. So if you contact me and you don't get a response within a couple hours, just be patient. I'll circle back with you as soon as I can.
David?
Yeah, you can find us on, of course, we're wildturkeyreport.com. We've got a Facebook page. Just search for Wild Turkey Report. Same with Instagram. And then on Twitter, we are Wild Turkey Report, and remove the O in report. Yeah, check us out, follow us, and you're going to see a lot of this type stuff on there. We try to be advocates for not only the hunting, but the conservation side of things.
Sure. And I think you've done a great job of that. And I really appreciate all the efforts that both of you have taken to try to get information out to people to conserve this species and many others. So thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Glad to join you.
Thank you, Marcus.
Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.